King Edward, Part 10. Josiah and Lucky, Part 2. Mats continued his story of Lucky and Josiah. The years passed, 20 of them. More children came. Timmy took a bride. The land continued to prosper. Few died, so there were many people now, and much of the forest was cleared for farms. Others became soldiers or sailors. Their voyages and battles all prospered, and they returned home laden with booty. The gods were with them, people said, for they were virtuous and deserving folk. Skyrim was united now under King Vrage, the Gifted, second and noblest son of the legendary Herald of Ysgramor. Thus Josiah's king was High King of all Skyrim. The Nords under Vrage's leadership spread into Morrowind and High Rock, conquering some of the sly and thievish Dark Elves and the weak and superstitious Bretons. Josiah and Lucky had opened a store and built a fine big house for their family. One night Josiah awoke alone and heard voices in the hall. She left her bed and crept to see. The voices sounded angry. Lucky was standing there, in his nightshirt. The passing years had changed him little. He looked no older, but he had grown leaner and paler and somehow less substantial. Standing with him were a tall, matronly woman, dark-haired, and clad in a fine blue robe, a knight in black armor carrying a black sword with a handsome blonde man green-clad with a bow. Two elves were there as well, one fair and one with golden skin. One had a harp, and the other a lute. Elves were not seen in Skyrim in years. How did quite simple Lucky come to know such grand people? "Is this how you keep your pack with us? Did we not make the rules clear to you?" The woman was shouting at Lucky, who only muttered, "Lady Mara, I didn't realize it had been so long. It was only for a few days, and then a few days more, and then there were the children, and Josiah needed me. I thought no harm. Things seem to go well for everyone. It hasn't been so long. Tamriel did well enough without me before." Lucky spoke softly, yet his face was set, and Josiah knew how stubborn he could be. "Everyone, what of the Bretons? What of the Dark Elves and the Wood Elves, of the Ice Elves? I say nothing. They are gone altogether, and forever." "Such shy folk. I tried," Lucky faltered. "I did try. The Ice Elves were very hard to find, and not that friendly when I did find them. Are all the Elves to follow them, and the Bretons, and then the other races? I'll go. I will go. But High Rock and Morrowind are so far from here, and how can I leave my children? Surely I am entitled to children, and my woman." "You could have arranged matters as I did," said the green-clad ranger. "Now it's too late for that. Matters have gone too far. We trusted you. It was a simple assignment, yet we should have watched him." This last sentence was addressed to the Black Knight. "I did watch him," the knight snapped, waving his sword, which Josiah now saw was actually a part of his arm. "Yet alone I could do nothing. I'd few devotees in either High Rock or Morrowind. Once I realized I knew I had to find the rest of you. Alone I could do little. What I could, I did. They're halted for now, yet the damage must be repaired, and he who caused it must do the fixing. Tinker. It won't be easy. You'll have to avoid the Skyrim folk altogether for a couple hundred years, I think." "No, my lord Ebenarm, no." The cry was wrenched from Lucky's heart. "I cannot, I implore you. Do not ask it of me. Leave me something of my own. Why must I always give it to others? I'm tired of it. You promised me a life, and what you gave me, that endless wandering, was not a life." The Black Knight Ebenarm scowled back at Lucky. "We are a gentle folk," the Wood Elf bard said in his musical voice, "yet Zenithar can no longer be restrained, and if he wars against you, the other elven god stands with him. If the gods war, Tamriel itself may be destroyed. You may find Daedra to stand with you. They love chaos, but I think you will find that not even Springseed, Ebenarm, and Mara will fight for you if you defy them further. Geoffrey speaks truth as ever. Let us not speak of war among ourselves, my friend. We wish your folk no ill. We deeply regret what has happened, and will labor to repair our fault. I regret our long absence, yet it was necessary. Rain and I were needed elsewhere," Mara said, "and not even a god or a goddess can be everywhere at once. As for you, Sai," she said, turning to Lucky, "one night a year with your woman and your children I will grant you, but not in the flesh. The temptations are too strong for you, I see. It was a mistake to let you hold the flesh so long. I apologize to the rest of you. Now go and make your farewells. You are dismissed." The knight and ranger vanished, but the elves remained. The golden-skinned one spoke to Mara. "Watch these new folk of yours more carefully, Lady Mara. We are a patient people, and kindly disposed to other sentient races, yet there are limits to our patience. Take warning." And the elves, too, were gone. Lucky fell to his knees, clutching at Mara's robe, his face a mask of anguish. "Lady, wait, I implore you. Am I never to feel again? Never? It is more than I can bear. The rest of you can assume mortal form on occasion. Better should I have died naturally and gone to rest," he added bitterly. Mara considered, frowning. Others have paid dearly for the life you have stolen. Their spirits are not at rest. They too will exact payment. And yet, very well, if you will labor to repair the damage you have done, then you may on occasion assume bodily form, but not as human. Wolf shape shall be yours, in return for the kindness you showed Relin. And she was gone, leaving Lucky standing alone, barefoot. Josiah ran to him and clasped him. Oh, how thin and cold he was. What is it, dearest? Who were they? What does it mean? Oh, don't leave us. I must, he said, shivering. I have stayed far too long. My dearest, I am luck itself. I was born with the talent, though mortal as yourself. My lord took me for a soldier. I was killed in my first battle. Even as the battle was won, I brought luck to others. To myself, never. Ebenarm appeared to me and said I am an interesting talent, and offered me immortality if I would agree to spread my luck about. He said the gods were overworked, seeing the two events and constantly quarreling over what should happen. He thought I could balance things out naturally with my inborn talent. I was young, I barely lived, I didn't want to die, so I agreed. And Ebenarm said that I could keep my body for a time. I wouldn't age or die, but I would fade slowly, as you have seen. I am nearly 80 now. I did as he bade for many years, then I met you, and found myself trapped by your need, I think. I was your luck, you see, what you needed, and truth is, I needed you too, my dear love. Yet while I've stayed here, my luck has spread like ripples, strongest in the center, weak along the edges, until there's none at all in Morrowind and High Rock, and the wilderness to the south, and the folks are dead or chained in slavery. Also, I've brought luck only to the Nords among whom I've lived, so that the Wood Elves have fled, and the Ice Elves have died. Now I must go and bring luck back to them, and redress the balance as it should have been. He went to the children's rooms and kissed them as they slept, while his tears fell on them. Then he said, I'll be with you one night each year. Though you will not see me, yet you will feel my presence, dearest. Oh, and I could never speak of love or marriage, but know I love you, as no man or god loved woman. Then he kissed her one last time and was gone. Matt stopped talking at last. The fire had burned down to ashes. Edward drew a long breath. That's some story, Edward said. Is it true? Are you calling my grandmother a liar? I know she used to leave a bit of food and a bowl of milk out on winter nights for the wolf, she said. And we Nords hold it very unlucky to attack a wolf unless it attacks you. It might be Sai. My grandmother said she got the tale from her great-grandmother, and her great was Josiah herself. So she said. Or maybe it was her great-great-grandmother. I get lost there. Anyways, it happened during the reign of King Vrage the Gifted, like I said, when the Nords invaded Morrowind and High Rock. It took Sai 150 years to get things set right again, and he needed a lot of help. For Morland's brother and father, among others. The Dark Elves and Bretons have been lucky to get their lands back, you see, and it's been a hard time for Skyrim folk. Although once your luck builds up the way theirs did, it takes a long time to really run out altogether. And Sai didn't make the same mistake again. He's been spreading luck around ever since. Otherwise folk get arrogant and start thinking they're entitled to more than others. Yes, he's kept his promise. You see, I'm his descendant, and once a year I feel his presence. That was tonight. I thought being a god meant you can just do as you please, Edward said. Well, they can, you see. Sai did, for a while, but he and his fellow gods weren't pleased with the result. There's rules to being a god, it seems, just as there are rules to being a man or a boy. Who makes the rules, then? Edward demanded. Mats laughed. Best save that question up for the Archmagister. It's much too deep for me. Well, I don't know about you, but I'm going to have a drink. I'm parched after all the talking, and then rouse myths so I can sleep myself. Mats, I was taught that Morland's father and brothers were just raiders and the Nords were the real owners of the land they took, that the Dark Elves come up out of the ground and raid for meanness and profit. Morland's father, Cronin, and his brothers, Kruths and Effin, took to raiding after the Nords drove them out of Ebonheart. Guerrilla warfare isn't pretty, but neither is losing your homeland. Human memories of that time are faded hand-me-downs, but there is a fair number of Dark Elves who lived through it still around. Morland's Aunt Yoris, for one. She who rules in Krakenmoor. Oh, there's some Dark Elves still, along the borderlands in Blacklight. We're just thieves and kidnappers, no question. They have holds up in the mountains, caverns, and raid farms and villages in East Skyrim. Morland's folks have naught to do with them. At least way not since they regained their own lands of Morrowind. Morland hates the raiding. He'd stop it if he could, Matt sighed. Why can't he? Matt yawned widely. That's a matter of politics and power, boy. You ask him about it, and you'll likely get more answers than you want. For once, me, I'm off to bed. Good night. and that was King Edward, Part 10. King Edward, Part 11. The companions stayed the night at the crude but comfortable inn at a tiny village that called itself Ravenspring, located in the foothills of the Rothgarian Mountains. The next morning, they resumed their journey eastward, moving through rolling hills towards the Skyrim and Hammerfell borders, camping the next 2 nights under the clear early summer skies. When they resumed traveling for the 3rd morning, Morland told everyone to watch the slopes north of the road for a notch opening to a high meadow that faced to the southwest. Shortly afterward, everyone spotted it almost simultaneously when the group completed a bend around a rocky outcrop. Silk and Beach went ahead to scout a good route and to look for a campsite for the evening ahead. By dusk, they had covered most of the distance to the meadow, but still faced some stiff climbing the next morning. They agreed that it was time to camp once again, but happily a lunchtime picnic seemed very likely the next day. By midday the next day, which was Lordas the 5th of mid-year, the companions were sprawled across a grassy slope within the dragon village, having been joined by Akatosh and one of the other dragons. This second dragon was smaller than Akatosh and seemed to be a female, although characteristically Akatosh had just introduced the dragon as Debudchin, with no further explanation being forthcoming. The 2 dragons politely chatted with the humanoids as they enjoyed their repast, though Debudchin flew off afterwards to arc gracefully above and then swoop down upon a steer in a grassy field some distance away. Akatosh had been watching Edward's reaction to this and asked, "Why did you flinch, Edward? Debudchin had not eaten recently and really behaved no differently than you just have." Edward replied with a small smile, "I don't think that our meal was quite that violent in nature." Akatosh returned that smile, but then responded, "A good reminder, then, that we are only similar rather than the same." Edward paused, squinting into the mid-afternoon sun, and then turned to the golden dragon. "Akatosh, why did you choose this spot for your village?" "Well, it was high enough up into the mountains to suit us, but flat enough for raising the cattle, with trees for the deer, and it's very defensible for all of us. There is plenty of room for the humans to build their ranches and farms, and the elves are quite comfortable in the dense trees along the cliff edges. The adits and the surrounding cliff faces provide us the access to our lairs, which we have located within the mining tunnels. All in all, an ideal site for such an experiment involving this many races of beings. It even opens to the southwest, providing reasonable warmth to the smaller beings with some protection from the elements during the colder months." Edward responded, "It is difficult for me to get used to the notion of village without some central concentration of buildings, but perhaps there will be developed in the future at least a few buildings for meetings and socializing, and I suppose that there are also some beautiful sunsets to be seen here." The dragon smiled again but replied, "Quite so, but I am the only one of the dragon kind to show any interest, and that was not a legitimate consideration when we chose this site." Then wistfully, "I wish that I could assemble the words to describe some of them. I have attempted this many times, but their results are just not very admirable." More briskly, "And by the way, we do intend to erect a meeting hall for the humanoids and also some stores for barter and other exchanges of goods." Morland had wandered over and seated himself, and he asked, with a notable absence of the usual humanoid respect for dragons, "Whatever possessed you to attempt such a crazy experiment, Akatosh?" The dragon paused thoughtfully and then replied, "As is my wont, I had been analyzing, in this case one might say the history of dragon behavior. Clearly our lengthy contest of resistance to these new Aurelian gods were futile, but it took many of our generations for us to realize and accept this. Then our next pattern was to isolate ourselves even from each other, and to resist intrusion from any and all beings. The exception, of course, was to mate among ourselves and procreate our race. However, aside from that one activity, we fought any and all for our precious privacy, and really for no good reason, except that we can be especially stubborn race." Edward said, "Then you maintained a pattern of behavior long after the reason for it was gone?" Akatosh looked a bit embarrassed. He said stiffly, "I believe that is what I just said. We are not the only sentient race to fall prey to that. Edward said the Archmagister has told me that much behavior is inborn." Orland smiled at him, and inborn behavior patterns are a particular problem for long-lived species who change slowly as conditions change. We elves suffer from it even more than you short-lived humans, which is why we like to keep things as they are. Though life is change, and to resist it utterly is death, dragons live far, far longer than even elves, and in consequence breed even more slowly. Still, who can say what alterations being born into a social setting may produce for good or ill in the dragon behavior? Aliera had by this time joined the conversation, observed, "The Daedra must have long been pleased with dragon behavior." Akatosh responded, "Perhaps so, but I approach our queen with this suggestion more so because it seemed clear to me that as a race we had fallen into a stasis, and we needed to break this shell in order to invigorate ourselves. She didn't quite agree with me, but perhaps because of my reputation, she told me to go ahead and make this attempt." By this point, all of the companions were sitting within hearing range, and Mats asked, "Did you have to get your queen's permission, and have there been many difficulties among the other races?" Permission is not quite accurate in this case. Mats, being the beings that we are, it was more so that I was obliged to tell her of this so that she would have the information. For example, other dragons regularly come to me with potential military intelligence, following this same philosophy of preparedness. Mats grinned and said, "You mean just in case, right? But what about the elves and the humans?" Our humanoid lord and lady do set a most remarkable example of tolerance and respect for differing shapes and customs. I owe a debt of gratitude to Morlin for the loan of his smiths and miners who have been most generous in sharing their knowledge and skills with the Bretons. That my young friend Edward and I have persuaded to attempt settlement here. It is my experience that Bretons, well, many Bretons, will do virtually anything so long as it is profitable and they gain skill and knowledge from it. The Nordic lust for individual honor and glory makes the mithril armor and weapons produced here extremely profitable. 'Twas sheer genius that inspired Aliera to insist that we sell only to the nobility, while the delving opens new tunnels and provides access to that which we dragons require. Akatosh smiled a little slyly. He was very reticent on the subject of exactly what dragons required. Beech and Willow had made it known among their people that the Wood Elves are welcomed here, so those who have long missed their ancient high rock homes have returned to these hills. Fortunate for me that I am now a duke and thus qualified to wear and carry mithril. If only I could afford more than a piece or two. But for the cost I might retire," Matt said. "If you retired, you would not require the mithril," Morlin pointed out. "And what of my son and daughter? Thinkst thou I will beg from thee for them?" Matt said indignantly. "My knees and wind may not be what they once were, I grant you. In fact, I'm somewhat tempted to remain up here. Now I am here, yet I can still swing my axe with any." Myth grinned delightedly. "Nords can't count. It's why they seek honor and glory, not profit. Honor and glory are not amenable and to enumeration, much past what one can tally on the fingers. Mats, if thou art but 39, thou went the largest 10-year-old human I ever met or hoped to meet. But what then are these benefits to those who neither delve nor smith?" Mats persisted, ignoring his old friend. "I would think that many would be terrified to live so close to such formidable beings." Matt spoke the last of this with a sly grin. "Well, on the other hand, the presence of the formidable beings means that they are certainly well protected, and this area is surprisingly fertile, so the crops seem to be growing well. And although they provide the meat for us, we allocate 1/5 of each herd to them for their own consumption. We've also been finding out what I have long suspected. The 3 sets of races, when combined, fight much more effectively than the sum of each when considered in isolation. That is, each race covers or cancels weaknesses of the others. At least it is certainly true. The local goblin population has been drastically reduced in a very short period of time." "Aye," Edward responded, so Morlin proved in Morrowind. With a bit of help from his friends, Morlin acknowledged, "I reap the praise, but I'm a little more than the standard they wave, and at times I feel more like the target they set up." A wave of laughter greeted this remark. Edward persisted, "With you and the others up here, Akatosh, I feel my borders are well guarded. Should Skyrim ever feel the urge to move its borders west again?" Aliera asked, "Was it easy to convince the other dragons to move to here?" "Actually, the most difficult part of that was moving our hordes in our new layers," Akatosh responded with a lazy smile. "Although once it was known that we had no use for the metals, gems, and jewelry that we accumulate, everything went much more smoothly. And then, more seriously, essentially, I had to approach each dragon personally and convince them that this idea had merit. Again, once I had persuaded a couple of our especially independent specimens, things went much more smoothly. However, there are only 9 of us living in this area, and there's really only room for 2 or 3 more of us. We shall have to see what develops hereafter." Aliera now observed, "I think that now the gods and goddesses might look very favorably indeed on dragon behavior." "That may be so, Aliera, but again, that was not really why this was done. Besides, They still may remember and resent our long opposition to them. Beach asked deferentially, "But what is the name of this village?" Akatosh sighed and then responded, "I fear that we shall never reach a decision, since each race has decided opinions in that regard. Perhaps once the initial building phase is complete, we'll be able to be more contemplative about such matters." Beach replied, "That just doesn't seem right. Everywhere should have a name, shouldn't it?" Willow chuckled and said, then, "Perhaps to us this is so, but who knows how dragons think? And I'm sure that the human and elves will squabble over the style of the name besides the specifics of it." Morley interrupted with great drama. "Surely you don't mean to imply that an elf can be overly stubborn," and the discussion dissolved into a period of laughter and teasing amongst the group. Presently Akatosh said, "I favor the name Section 22. Beach stared at him. "Akatosh, I see what thou dost mean about thy difficulties with poetic. If you will allow my frank opinion, that is the single worst village name I have ever heard." Akatosh sighed gustily, then pardoned himself hastily to Beach. "Humanoids found Dragon's Sight quite unpleasant and sometimes actually hazardous. Then thou seest what I mean by differences. To me it is very meaningful and most appropriate. Is Section 16A better as a name? Not? Then it is the word section that offends you. In that way, is it inferior to keep, or Reich, or Glen, or Hold?" Edward said, "But Akatosh, a name should make some sense. At least humans think so. You should have 21 other sections first, if you're going to name this place 22. "Really?" Akatosh said. "Why is that? Aren't all numbers equally valid? They serve well to distinguish one place from another. There could be many green vales, for instance. I myself know of 4 such villages. The number 22 does appeal to me aesthetically, as well as possessing some sense, at least to me." He smiled secretively. Moreland said, "I think Lord Akatosh is enjoying what some call an in-joke. Were I so rash to instruct a dragon in manners?" "Who," Soak said, "would ever accuse Moreland of being so rash?" A bit later, Edward asked Akatosh, "Do you think that we could play a game or two of battle? I brought the board and a few playing pieces with me." Moreland interrupted, "I'm afraid that Akatosh and I must discuss some matters this evening, and you'd only lose it again anyway," he added with a fond smile. Edward replied, "But I could beat everyone else. Akatosh, will I ever win a game with you?" "No, Edward, you won't," and Akatosh was slightly bemused by Edward's startled expression, and then the hearty laugh that quickly followed it. "That wasn't very diplomatic of you, Akatosh. But why won't I ever win?" "Because I have been playing for much longer than you have, Edward, and so long I can continue to play, you will not be able to catch up to me. Besides, this game is what I am starting to think of as a bounded problem, and the sort is most easily dealt with." "What do you mean by a bounded problem?" Akatosh asked Mats. "That is a problem that has a countable number of possible actions and results, Mats. There are only 81 squares on the board, and each side has exactly 27 playing pieces. Each piece moves in a specific way, and so on." "But the game is like a real battle, isn't it?" asked Saas. "No, it is a very good practice for learning and for thinking about how to execute a battle, but my elven archers never become tired or demoralized, and my master mage always does what I want. Such things seldom happen in real battle." Moreland nodded in agreement and asked with mock slyness, "Then what is an example of an unbounded problem?" "Certainly a real battle, but also, to me, a poem is an unbounded problem." "But any poem can be analyzed," Akatosh Allier said chidingly. "Of course, but only after it is written. I am unable to define or bound the act of writing, though. That is the act of creating it. If I start to write a poem, there are so many possibilities, and then, Riley, I never get beyond the first line, because I start imagining all the things that I could put into the beginning, and that was King Edward, Part 11. King Edward, Part 12. The dragon had paused, so Edward interjected, "Mother and I have been discussing the nature of the gods recently. Akatosh, and she thinks that poetry would be a godly activity. What do you think about that notion?" "I'm not so certain that one can attribute anything to the gods, Edward. There are another example of an unbounded problem, of course, but also their characteristics are just not very well known to us." "But surely one can determine things about any beings that is a god." Akatosh replied, "I do not think that we can at present. They are not like the Daedra, who have a nature that is with them at their birth. That is, the Daedra capabilities are inherent in them, and not the result of any changes that have occurred to them." Willow interrupted, "Akatosh, we can determine that the gods have a few basic characteristics, can't we?" Edward added, "Of course, Akatosh, they are powerful beings who can perform acts that are incomprehensible to us. That in and of itself must signify their differences." Akatosh nodded and replied, "I understand your point of view, but to a farming community on Tamriel in our southern lands, that could also describe how they would perceive me. Perhaps this is an attribute to the fact that they seldom see a dragon nowadays, but it also does not mean that I am a god, neither does it mean that I am not a god. Willow giggled and said, "Of course, you're not a god, Akatosh," and Edward, smiling, nodded in agreement. Akatosh replied, "How do you know, Willow? I can understand that you would guess that I am not a god, particularly since I am a dragon." He grinned and then continued, "But how can you know that I am not a god?" Edward scoffingly replied, "Well, I know that I'm not a god anyway, and I've certainly never seen you perform any godly acts, Akatosh. You also don't seem to have any worshippers about, either." The companions were smiling and generally agreeing with this, but Akatosh responded, "That does not mean that I have no worshippers, nor does it mean that I cannot perform any godly acts. It just means that you have not seen either of these. I am not yet certain that gods and goddesses require worshippers to maintain their existence, and as I said, I can perform magic that would look like godly acts to many Tamrillians." "But the gods must have worshippers," Akatosh said. Aliera. "That's how they get their sustenance, or whatever it is that allows them to continue to be godly. Husband, you must know more about the subject. After all, you made a god of your brother Sephin." "I did no such thing," Morlun responded with a touch of indignation. "His godhood is between him and his worshippers, among whom I am numbered. I did establish a temple cult in his memory. Anyone with the worldly means could do as much for anyone, living or dead. That alone is not enough. Maybe it helps facilitate matters, but I think it's not really necessary. I know no more of it, but if you want my opinion," he paused politely for confirmation that it was indeed still solicited as elven etiquette demanded if one were given opinion at length. He continued, "There must be something, well, godly in the person's soul or essence, or whatever part it is that does not die with the body. I know not whether the capacity is innate in the person from birth, or conception, or quickening. Whatever it is, that soul and body are wedded for a lifespan, or whether great deeds and great generosity might breed it, enlarging the soul and transmuting it, so to speak. We all change and grow with each passing day, with each breath, some more than others. What else is life about?" He went on without pausing for an answer to his rhetorical question, probably for fear that he might get one. In other cases, gods seem to arise from locality, a mountain or a spring or a wood or a collection of localities, such as Tamriel itself. Places like persons have souls, some greater than others. This place might produce a god or a daedra, or maybe it already has one or more. As it changes, so do its gods and daedra. I think maybe they can choose to resist or change or aid it." He looked at Akatosh inquiringly. Dragon had stopped fighting the new gods, he said, but would he go so far as to worship them? That speaks to the question of whence gods arise, but source is not nature. Of that I know. As little as the rest of you, maybe less, since the question does not truly interest me. The gods are, my worship of them benefits me and mine. It is sufficient. Akatosh did not respond immediately, and Aliera refused to be distracted. But suppose such a cult were established and worshippers provided for one of a small and mean spirit. Would that spirit not become a god? I suppose it might be done if one were determined enough and had a sufficiency of means to pay worshippers to perform rituals without spirit behind them. Maybe that's where small mean gods come from, wife, or maybe Daedra. Maybe I'll raise a cult to thee and see what happens. Are you calling my spirit small and mean? Ali glared at him. Only by comparison. You don't fancy yourself a goddess, do you? You might make a Daedra, though. The experiment might be a bit too chancy. Could I just mourn you for a century or two instead? I'll think on it. What about you? You've deeds enough already to qualify for godhood, surely. Although, if you plan on many more such, you may not outlive me. I'm doomed to be Rotham, living and dead. It's godhood of a sort. But what a sort. Don't begrudge me or my long lifespan. Think of me doomed to eternity in the gloomy Ebonheart council chamber, listening to the eternal wrangles. Small wonder the dead Rotham pulled the place down on the live ones 20 years ago, thus causing my brother and my mother to join their number. The dead Rotham must have welcomed the century and a half of respite while the Nords held Ebonheart. But your brother Sephin was killed too, as well as your brother King Kruths, and Sephin wasn't Rotham, being your mother's son and not your father's. If I have the story straight, that's why he got his own temple, Edward said. So why did they kill him too? The story sounds very Daedric to me. You'd have me justify the ways of the gods to you, would you? I think they act for ends we cannot see, and slay the just and the unjust together. Not that I'd label any of my kin as either, not altogether. We see only the means, how can we judge? Gods too face choices. I do not think their power is supreme. They can overrule nature on occasion, and as can any mage, yet they, like mages, are in the end bound by it, and their overrule must answer other rules still. And in those rules, whatever they might be, I think lies the answers to your questions. I think it's not something men and women may know while living. Akatosh smiled and replied, "It is not so easy to describe the gods. This is true even though myself included, each of us thinks that we have a mental picture of what godliness means. On the other hand, the gods and goddesses certainly do exist, and I also believe that there is a connection of some sort between them and the Daedra, and another connection between these entities and the power associated with performing magic. The priests of Julianos have been calling this power Magica," said a stranger who had joined the group. Akatosh replied, "Greetings, Bard. Please allow me to introduce Geoffrey, a wonderful poet who has been visiting our village for these last few days." The companions greeted the wood elf newcomer, some rising to their feet to do so according to the individual customs, and then all resumed sitting, actually sprawling about and conversing. A number of priests are theorizing that the gods and goddesses live on another plane, as do the Daedra. There is some debate amongst the priests as to whether they share the same plane of existence or whether each has their own, and some of the Elysian priests are claiming that we can visit these alternate planes in our nightly dreams at a beach. Edward asked, "Why didn't someone just ask a goddess or a Daedra about this?" Geoffrey chuckled and replied, Most of us are not able to be so thoughtful when confronted by one of these beings, Edward. Also, there's a common belief that the gods and Daedra are reluctant to discuss their own natures as dragons are to reveal anyone's true name." Edward looked quizzically at Akatosh, but each stated Geoffrey, "Well said, Bard," and that pair shared the slightest smiles. Beach then said, "Do you know what the resolutions of Zenithar has been saying about the gods or magic? This magic power, or magica, is just the power generated by the existence of, well, itself. When it becomes focused by living beings through the natural process, then it becomes accessible to the gods and the goddesses as worship power, which is the next level of magica. After receiving some from their worshippers, the gods can then concentrate it up to a god-level power, the true magica. The gods themselves can't generate the mid-level magica since they are dependent on it for their own existence, but they can convert it to magica, which can then be used by mortals to cast spells. This magica is usually dispersed widely across the planes, but there are some areas of greater and lesser concentrations due to interferences with the dispersion process. When a goddess loses worshippers, her inflow of mid-level magica is decreased, so she in turn produces less god-level magica. With this less magica under her control for providing to worshippers or dispersion, her influence is decreased in the mortal planes. Of course, the converse is also true. In the extreme, she receives nothing and is relegated to a state of stasis, barely existing from the ordinary magica generated by her few remaining consecrated lands, zones of influence, and so on. Beach continued, "On the other hand, Daedra receive very specific or modified mid-level magica from a few mortals with specific areas of interest, and these Daedras are normally tied to very specific circumstances. Because of their nature, they gain much more power from their small worship base, but the gods, with their much broader base, generally have much greater overall power. Even though the amount of concentrated worshippers that they receive from any one source is much less than the Daedras, most of the magica that the gods process is dispersed into and throughout the universe, no longer under their control, thereby making it available for everyone. It's not really something they do consciously, but as a natural process that happens automatically. In other words, just because they are divine." Aliera said, "I would think that magica is simply available to sentient beings, although the gods and the Daedra could facilitate its usage. I would think that the gods and Daedra have other influences on us as well, because not everyone has spellcasting abilities. Maybe in those alternate planes it's actually existences and not the sentient entities that radiates magica, just as the stars give off light in our dimension. I assume that magica is out there in the ether, or maybe some sentient consciousness automatically tap into an alternate plane as they sleep. I think that everyone has some supply of magica, but most don't know how to use it very well, or else they adopt a way of life that inhibits or forbids its use. Maybe certain gods and Daedra serve as facilitators for the entire process, that is, both obtaining and using magica. But how do priests heal and cure and bless? Is magica involved at all, or do they invoke their goddesses directly?" Saas said, "I'm not sure what magica is used. Perhaps there is yet another capability involved here. This capability would be unknown at this time, and maybe even unused, but I feel fairly certain that somehow it's a godly force that they are employing. Then Jeffrey responded, Saas, I believe that Magicka feels the universe of planes. All things are infused with Magicka to one extent or another. In this regard, Magicka is attracted to some people and things over others, and some people with talent or training can control and even release Magicka in new forms. There may be other sources of Magicka available by tapping into alternate and otherworldly planes. There is also the possibility of alternate planes that are entirely void of Magicka. Regardless, certain beings of great power, such as the gods and Daedra, can not only control Magicka, but can see, absorb, and transfuse Magicka to and from objects and people. By employing this ability, worshippers of these beings are sometimes capable of great acts of magic that they could accomplish otherwise. Also, in this way, some items sacred to powerful beings can be said to be holy, with additional amounts of directed Magicka provided by gods or goddesses. Magic items fall into two main categories by definition: items that can draw on the surrounding Magicka to create spell-like effects, and items that hold Magicka in reserve for their own internal effects. Normally, magic items with absorb Magicka give increased abilities to their wielders, only affect themselves, and are considered to use internal Magicka. In some areas where great amounts of Magicka have been used, the surroundings may be completely devoid of it. This, of course, negates the ability of beings to produce magic effects in these areas, although gods and Daedras carry their own supplies of Magicka, as do magic items that do not depend on the use of surrounding Magicka. Aliera said, we've been investigating some rumor and stories concerning something that might be called anti-Magicka. I think the presence of a powerful Daedra with whom you weren't in tune could cause interference with spellcasting, maybe even cancel out existing spells. Perhaps particular Daedra simply favor thief or warrior types, or some goddesses and their priests might frown on competing magic in certain areas. For example, in the locations dedicated to them, so then unauthorized spells could interfere with their rituals. Willow asked, can Daedra supply Magicka, and how about both a god and a Daedra being nearby? Wouldn't they sort of nullify each other's powers? This might be the cause of the anti-Magicka effect. I've experienced an anti-Magicka zone myself at certain myth. It felt a lot like the effect of casting a spell like Dispel Magicka. At the time, I thought that a truly powerful spellcaster could still effectively cast spells, but their resulting power would have been much reduced. I didn't get a chance to test this out though, added Myth with a smile. We can also assume that certain powerful spells, creatures, and even magic items might actually drain the surrounding area of Magicka, replied Jeffrey. This could be extended to places where the great amounts of magic energy were once gathered and expended, for example, in ancient temples where great spells were cast, or battlefields where powerful mages contested. Perhaps certain metals or stones could act as absorbers of Magicka, allowing for whole structures of anti-Magicka zones. If so, you might be able to wear an amulet made out of anti-Magicka material and gain a good advantage against spellcasters. Perhaps the purity of the material used would allow for better and better Magicka resistance. Akatosh spoke. Dragons have long been interested in the anti-Magicka effect. Naturally enough, we have found some amulets that appear to act as Magicka absorbers. They might contain something like negative Magicka, in which they would attract any stray Magicka floating free in the local area. They are made of stone or mineral resembling marble. It is very rare, but could be extracted and shaped by skilled craftsmen. For example, I'm sure that the dwarves could have worked with this material. They might have made these amulets, or even the statue that I once saw. It was taller than any of you humanoids. Regardless, in these mountains we have found deposits scattered throughout the halls and tunnels at random, sometimes deep within the walls. Consequently, one appears to go in and out of these anti-Magicka zones of varying intensities with little or no warning. I have been imagining that this material works almost automatically. It seems to reflexively absorb Magicka, if given a chance to. However, we cannot rule out the possibility that they have been magically charged somehow. Perhaps this happened long ago, but the charge has somehow remained. Morlin asked, would the amulet affect its wearer, or would he be immune? Maybe a blocking spell could be developed and then cast to shield the wearer from the effects of the substance. Morlin then asked, but Akatosh, getting back to our earlier discussions, what do you think of the speculation concerning the connections between the gods and the goddesses, Daedra and Magicka? Akatosh replied, I think that there are many truths and we do not know, and perhaps there are some truths we are not meant to know. Morlin asked with a smile, all right then, I've always wanted to know this. Considering the shape of your mouth and teeth, how do dragons manage to speak the humanoid language so clearly? Akatosh paused and carefully responded, why, in much the same way that we can fly, even though our wings are not naturally strong enough to support much to support such heavy torsos. Speaking of Dragon's Flight, Sunset Smith said, rising to his feet and squinting into the red-gold eastern sky, we have a visitor. Dragon Lord, that's not a bird. Akatosh's head came up, and he too scanned the sky. Tensions grew in him, and one by one the companions rose, watching as the distant dot grew nearer and resolved itself into the largest dragon they'd seen yet. Matilda, Akatosh exclaimed. She deigns to bestow her presence on us. His wings lifted and unfurled, and the companions broke and ran for cover as he took to flight. The two dragons wheeled through the sky, spouting great gouts of flame against the purpling sky. They're fighting, Edward cried. What does this mean? Who is Matilda? I don't know who she is, son, Morlun replied, but they do not fight. You behold a dragon greeting ceremony. The pair lit beyond a rock outcropping out of sight. Should we go greet the stranger too? Edward asked. Nay, Myth said. They'll let us know if our presence is wanted. Look, even the other dragons stay away. It was true. Dragon heads had poked from the caverns to witness the event, but none of them had taken wings, and now they were all retreating into their hordes within. The companions ambled back into the meadow together and built a fire as a chill wind had sprung up. The elves sang an evening hymn to the stars, deftly weaving the dark elves' version with the wood elf horn. Eliara added her voice to theirs, but Mats and Edward and Silk and Sass sat listening silently. They couldn't manage elven music of this kind. Geoffrey had a particularly clear, sweet voice, Edward thought. Akatosh returned presently, smiling in satisfaction. Matilda is going to join us here, at least for a while, he said. He's actually glowing in the dusk, each scale giving off a golden radiance. Is she your queen? Edward asked, feeling very small and human. She just is. Maybe she'll want to meet you all someday. I hope so. Until then, well, I don't talk about other dragons, you know. To which Edward blinked in surprise and in surmise, and the discussion dissolved into jokes and songs for the remainder of that clear and beautiful evening. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was King Edward, Part 12, and also the end of the King Edward book series. Alright, thank you guys so much for watching today's bonus episode of the Elder Scrolls II Daggerfall. Tune in tomorrow as we read another 3 books in another bonus episode. So thank you guys so much, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.